The day I realized someone had stolen my life, I was standing in my own kitchen, wearing my apron, using my coffee mug, and she looked up at me like I was the one who didn't belong there. My name is Morgan Hendress. I'm an ER nurse. I've held the hands of strangers in their worst moments. I've stayed calm when everything around me was falling apart. I thought that made me unshakable. I thought that meant nothing could catch me off guard. I was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened, you need to understand who I was before it did. I grew up in a house where you didn't complain. You showed up. You helped. You were the strong one. And I wore that like a badge of honor for 34 years. I was the daughter who called every Sunday. The sister who lent money without asking when it was coming back. The one who showed up with casseroles and no judgment. Ryan used to tease me about it. He'd say, "Morgan, you'd give someone the shirt off your back and then apologize for not ironing it first." And I'd laugh, because it was true. Because I thought that's what love looked like. Making yourself useful. Making yourself small enough to fit wherever someone needed you. Ryan and I met in our late 20s. He was already in the military when we got together, so I knew what I was signing up for. The long stretches of silence, the phone calls that cut off mid-sentence, the empty side of the bed that never quite felt normal, no matter how many times I woke up to it. But we made it work. We always made it work. That's what we did. We showed up for each other even when there were thousands of miles between us. We bought our house 3 years into our marriage, a 2-story colonial in a quiet suburb of Virginia. 4 bedrooms, one for us, one for Ryan's home office, one that I'd started quietly imagining as a nursery, and one guest room we'd painted a soft sage green because I read somewhere that sage was calming. We put our whole hearts into that house. Hung pictures, planted a garden, learned which floorboards creaked and avoided them out of habit. It wasn't just a house, it was us. Everything we were building together, in wood and paint and mortgage payments. And then Ryan got his deployment orders. 14 months, overseas, the longest stretch we'd ever faced. I won't pretend I didn't cry. I cried plenty. But then I did what I always do. I made a plan. I picked up a temporary nursing contract 3 states away in a hospital that was short-staffed and offered good pay and a furnished apartment. It made sense, financially, practically, emotionally. Sitting alone in our house for 14 months felt like it would break me. Working would keep me sane. Helping people always did. I arranged everything before I left. I set up automatic payments for the mortgage, the utilities, the HOA. I had our mail forwarded to my temporary address. I asked our neighbor Carol to keep an eye on things. I gave her my number. I gave her Ryan's number. I left a spare key hidden in the garden, inside a fake rock that Ryan had bought as a joke and I'd kept because it actually worked. I was thorough. I was careful. I was an ER nurse. I was always thorough and careful. What I did not do, what I never in a million years imagined I would need to do, was tell my own family that they were not allowed in my home. That was my first mistake. My parents, Janet and Ray, lived about 40 minutes from our house. We were close enough that dropping by was normal. They had a key. Of course they had a key. They were my parents. They'd used it a handful of times over the years. Once when I locked myself out. Once to bring in packages during a storm. Nothing that ever raised a flag. Nothing that ever made me think I needed to set boundaries around something as basic as my own front door. And Denise. My sister, Denise. 2 years younger than me and in almost every way my opposite. Where I was steady, she was scattered. Where I saved, she spent. Where I planned, she improvised, and usually expected someone else to clean up the aftermath. But she was my sister. We'd shared a bedroom growing up, fought over the bathroom, stayed up too late talking about boys we liked and dreams we had. Whatever her flaws, she was mine, and I loved her the way you love the people you grew up with, automatically, without condition, without a whole lot of scrutiny. I should have applied more scrutiny. I'd been at my temporary posting for about 6 weeks when I started noticing small things. The first was a charge on one of our utility accounts, a change to the billing address. I thought it was a glitch. I called the utility company, got it corrected, and moved on. The second thing was an email from our HOA about a noise complaint, a gathering at our property on a Saturday night. I emailed back and said there must be a mistake, that our house was unoccupied. They said they'd look into it. The third thing was Carol. Carol texted me about 5 weeks in. Just a casual message. She said, "Hey Morgan, just wanted to check. Is your sister staying with you for a while? I saw her going in and out a few times. She waved at me, so I assumed you knew." I stared at that text for a long time. Then I typed back, "What do you mean she's going in and out?" And Carol said, "She's been there about 3 weeks. I thought you knew." 3 weeks. My sister had been living in my house for 3 weeks and no one had told me. I called my mother first. I don't know why I called my mother first. Maybe because some part of me already knew. Janet picked up on the second ring, and before I could even say hello, she launched into this explanation that was so polished, so practiced, that I realized immediately she'd been waiting for this call. She said Denise had been having a hard time. Her apartment lease had ended and she hadn't found a new place yet, and they didn't have room at their house. She didn't say why, she skipped right past that. And she said it was just temporary, just a few weeks, and the house was just sitting there empty and it wasn't hurting anyone. She said it like I was being unreasonable by not knowing, like my objection was the problem. I said, "Mom, you did not ask me." She said, "You would have said yes." I want you to sit with that for a second. You would have said yes. As if the asking didn't matter. As if my consent was just a formality they'd decided to skip because they already knew the answer. That sentence right there, that was the moment I understood that a line had been crossed. Not just practically, not just legally. Something fundamental had shifted in how my family saw me. Not as a person with a home and a life and a right to decide who entered it, but as a resource, a reliable yes, a backup plan that didn't need to be consulted. I told my mother I would call her back. I hung up, and then I sat in my tiny furnished apartment 3 states away, and I went into what Ryan calls my ER mode. I stopped feeling. I started thinking. I made a list. The list started with questions. How long had Denise actually been there? What was she telling people? Had anything been moved, damaged, used? Were the utilities in my name being run up? Was the mail situation handled? Because I'd set up a forward, but was it working? And why? Why had my mother said they didn't have room at their house? What did that mean? What was she not telling me? I called Ryan next. The connection was bad, like it always was, and I had to repeat myself twice. When he finally understood what I was saying, there was a long pause, and then he said, very quietly, "Morgan, get documentation, everything you can find. Do it now, before anything gets moved or changed." That was Ryan, always 2 steps ahead, always thinking about what we'd need later. I love that man. Over the next several days, I started piecing things together. I called the utility companies. I called the HOA. I started going through account records and financial statements for anything connected to the house. And what I found, when I put all of it together, was not a sister crashing on a couch for a few weeks. It was something else entirely. Denise wasn't just staying in my house. She was living in my house. She'd moved her clothes into my closet. My clothes were pushed to one side and hers were hanging right next to them. She was using my kitchen, my furniture, my garden tools. Carol told me later that she'd introduced herself to a new neighbor down the street as Morgan. Not, "I'm staying at Morgan's place." Not, "I'm Morgan's sister." Just, Morgan. Like she'd stepped into my skin and decided she fit. And then I found the financial piece. There had been an inquiry, not a completed transaction, but an inquiry, into Ryan's BAH, his basic allowance for housing, military benefits. Someone had submitted paperwork attempting to redirect a portion of those payments, claiming a change in the primary household occupant's status. The paperwork had a signature on it. My signature. Except I hadn't signed anything. My mother and my sister had forged my signature on a federal benefits document. Let me say that again so it lands the way it landed for me. They forged my signature on a federal document, attempting to redirect my deployed husband's military housing benefits into an account that was not ours. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there in the dark of my little furnished apartment, and I thought about every Sunday phone call, every holiday dinner, every time I'd lent money or given advice or driven 40 minutes to help with something that could have waited. I thought about Denise crying on my shoulder after her last breakup, and my mother holding my hand when Ryan deployed the first time, and all of those moments felt different now. They felt like transactions I hadn't known I was part of. Was any of it real? That's the question that wrecked me more than the legal stuff, more than the money. The question of whether the love was real, or whether I'd just been useful. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not yet. Ryan was still deployed. Our house was still occupied by someone who was impersonating me, and I had a case to build. I went back into ER mode. I created a folder, digital and physical. Every utility statement showing the address change attempt, every HOA record, the transcript of my conversation with Carol, screenshots of texts from my mother, the inquiry documentation on Ryan's BAH. I'd gotten a copy through the military financial office, flagging it as a potential fraud case, which it was. I documented the timeline. I documented every phone call. I noted dates, times, what was said. I also called a lawyer, a real estate attorney first, to understand my rights as the property owner regarding unauthorized occupancy. Then a family law attorney, because this wasn't just a housing issue anymore. And then I made one more call, to the JAG office, the military's legal arm, because someone had attempted to commit fraud against a deployed service member's benefits, and that is a federal matter, and I wanted the right people to know about it. I was thorough. I was careful. This time, it was going to count for something. About 2 weeks into my documentation process, my mother called me again. Her tone had shifted. She wasn't explaining anymore. She was managing. She said things like, "Let's not make this bigger than it is," and "Denise is going through a hard time," and "You've always been the strong one, Morgan. We knew you could handle it." That last one almost broke through my ER mode. "You've always been the strong one." Said to justify making me carry something I never agreed to carry. Said as a compliment that was actually a cage. I said, "Mom, I need you to hear me clearly. Denise needs to be out of my house within 2 weeks. I need a full accounting of every utility dollar spent, every piece of mail that came to that address, and written confirmation that the BAH inquiry was initiated by you or Denise without my knowledge. I need that in writing." She said, "You're being dramatic." That was the moment the grief started. Real grief. The kind that feels like losing someone who isn't dead. Because I'd been raised to believe that family meant something. That the people who knew you longest were the ones who would never, could never, look you in the eye and dismiss the violation of your home and your identity as drama. And here was my mother, the woman who taught me to be reliable, to be strong, to always show up. Here she was, using every one of those qualities against me. I thought about all the years I'd spent being the strong one, how I'd worn it like a compliment, how I'd never once stopped to ask what the other side of that coin looked like, what it meant to be so strong that the people who loved you decided you didn't need protecting, what it meant to be so reliable that no one thought to ask if you were okay with bearing the weight. I thought about every time I'd said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I'd picked up the phone at midnight, every loan that didn't come back, every favor that turned into an expectation. I'd been so busy being the strong one that I'd accidentally taught the people around me that I was a resource, not a person. And I decided right then that I was done teaching that lesson. Ryan and I had weekly video calls when the connection allowed, and on one of those calls, I spread my folder open on the table in front of the camera, and I walked him through everything. He was quiet for a long time after. The way Ryan gets quiet when he's furious, but choosing not to be loud about it. He said, "We're going to go home, Morgan, and we're going to handle this, together." And I believed him, because that's what we did. We showed up for each other. I want to pause here and tell you something about the nature of betrayal, because I think people misunderstand it. They think the worst part is the act itself, the moment of discovery, the proof. But that's not actually the worst part. The worst part comes later, in the quiet moments, when you're going through your memories like a photo album and asking yourself, was this real? Was that real? When did it start? How long were they lying to me and smiling at the same time? Because Denise hadn't just moved into my house. She'd started telling people she was me. And that meant she'd been smiling and waving and introducing herself as Morgan Hendris to neighbors who didn't know the difference. She'd been wearing my identity like a costume. And every time she did it, she wasn't just lying to them, she was erasing me. There's something uniquely violating about that. About someone deciding that your identity is available for their use, that your name, your home, your reputation in your community is just up for grabs. I don't have words strong enough for how that feels. I've spent my entire career being seen clearly, by patients, by colleagues, by the people I show up for in their worst moments. My name means something to me. My name is mine. And she borrowed it like it was a dress. I kept working. I kept documenting. I kept my ER mode running even when my personal mode was cracking around the edges. Some nights I cried. Some nights I didn't feel anything at all, which was worse in its own way. But every morning I got up and I went to work and I held strangers' hands through their worst days, and it reminded me that hard things are survivable. That people come through the worst moments and they're still standing. I was going to be still standing. About 8 weeks before Ryan's deployment was scheduled to end, I got a piece of information that I hadn't been looking for, but that answered the question my mother had skipped past. Why didn't Denise just stay with our parents? Why was it that Janet had said there wasn't room? Our neighbor Carol, bless her, had stayed in careful contact with me this whole time. She was the kind of woman who notices things, who's lived in a neighborhood long enough to understand its rhythms and recognize when something's off. She mentioned casually, in one of our check-in texts, that she'd run into Ray, my father, at the grocery store. And Ray, who was not a complicated man, who wore everything on his face, had looked uncomfortable, and then said something that Carol didn't understand at the time, but repeated to me exactly. He said, "Janet's got some things to sort out. Hoping this helps everybody." Hoping this helps everybody. I turned that over in my mind for days. And then I went back through my mother's financial footprint. Not her private accounts, nothing I shouldn't access, but the things that were connected to our household in various ways. And I found it. A pattern of redirected household expenses. Money that should have been going toward our house, utilities, minor maintenance charges that had been added to accounts, was being filtered in a way that benefited a secondary account. An account that I eventually traced to a credit card in my mother's name. Janet had debt, hidden debt, and she had used the rent that Denise was supposedly paying, which was actually drawn from redirected household money, some of it connected to our accounts, to cover her payments. Denise wasn't paying my parents for staying in my house. Denise was siphoning from my household to pay my mother, who was paying down a credit card she didn't want my father to know about. It was a shell game, and my home, my life, was the table they were playing it on. How long? That was the question that kept coming back. Not what or how. I had those answered. But how long had this been the plan? Had Denise's lease ending been real, or had it been an opportunity they'd spotted and moved toward deliberately? Had my deployment, my temporary contract 3 states away, my husband's deployment, had all of that looked like a window to them? Had they seen me leave and thought, there it is? I'll never know the full answer to that, and I've had to make peace with not knowing, because some questions, when you dig for the answer, just hurt you more and don't change anything. What I know is what I can prove. What I can prove is what I built my case around. And by the time Ryan's deployment end date was 2 weeks out, my case was built. I had everything. The utility tampering documentation, the HOA records, the neighbor testimony, the BAH inquiry paperwork, and the military fraud report I'd filed. The text messages from my mother that showed her knowledge and consent. The forged signature documentation, verified by a handwriting analyst I'd hired through my attorney. The financial trace connecting the redirected funds to Janet's credit card payments. All of it, organized, dated, cross-referenced. My attorney told me she'd rarely seen a client come in as prepared as I was. I told her I was an ER nurse. We document everything. Ryan came home on a Thursday. I flew in the night before and stayed in a hotel. I didn't want to go to the house before he was with me. I wanted us to walk in together. I wanted the first time I faced that threshold to be with my person beside me. We took a rideshare from the airport. Ryan had his deployment bag over one shoulder, and I had my folder under my arm. That folder had traveled with me across 3 states and several months, and it was battered at the edges, but everything inside was intact. We pulled up in front of our house, and we sat there for a second. He took my hand. He said, "Ready?" I said, "Yeah. Let's go get our house back." We didn't call ahead. We'd made that decision deliberately, on advice of counsel. Showing up unannounced meant less time for anyone to move things, dispose of anything, coordinate a story. We had a legal right to enter our own home. That right had never gone away, no matter who'd decided to make themselves comfortable in it. Ryan used his key. The door opened, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not our smell, not the particular combination of our laundry and our coffee and our life that a home develops over time. It smelled different. Candles I didn't own, food I hadn't cooked, someone else's existence layered over ours. And then Denise walked out of the kitchen. She was wearing my cardigan. The gray one with the wooden buttons that I'd had for 6 years, the one I wore on hard shifts, the one that I'd packed and then unpacked at the last minute because I thought I'd need it here. She stopped when she saw Ryan. She hadn't expected Ryan. I don't think she'd fully processed that the deployment was ending because she'd never, not once, in any of the calls or texts with my mother, asked about him. Not when he was coming back, not how he was doing, not once. She looked at me then, and I watched the calculation happen in real time behind her eyes. The assessment of how much I knew. The decision about which version of this to play. She chose regret. She said, "Morgan, I was going to be out before you got back. I just needed a little more time." And I said, "You have 2 hours." She said she didn't have anywhere to go. I said that wasn't my problem anymore. She said Mom would be upset. I said Mom could call my attorney. She said I was being cold. I said, "Denise, look around you. Look at where you are right now and why, and then tell me I'm the one being cold." She didn't have an answer for that. She went upstairs to pack. While she was packing, Ryan and I walked through the house. We documented everything. Every room, every space, every item that had been moved or replaced or damaged. My closet, where her clothes hung beside mine. The guest room, which she'd clearly been using as a secondary wardrobe. The kitchen, where my good cast iron pan had a crack in the handle from being dropped on the tile. The garage, where a storage box of Ryan's had been opened and some of its contents were missing. Ryan photographed everything quietly, systematically, with the same controlled expression he'd had since we walked in the door. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Later, much later, he told me that walking through our home like that, inventorying the evidence of someone else's life lived in our space, was one of the hardest things he'd done. Harder than some of what he'd faced on deployment. Because it was supposed to be safe. Home was supposed to be the safe thing. I knew exactly what he meant. Denise was gone within the 2 hours. She left without saying goodbye. She took her things and she left, and the door closed and the house was ours again, in the physical sense. But there was still the other piece, the piece that mattered more. My parents. We called them the next morning. Not a surprise visit. I wanted them to have a day to think about what was coming. I wanted them to know it was coming. I asked them to come to the house, and the phrasing I used, according to my attorney's guidance, was, "We need to discuss the events of the last several months and the documentation we've collected." Not a confrontation, a meeting. The distinction mattered legally, and it mattered to me personally, because I wasn't going there to scream. I was going there to be clear. They showed up at 10 in the morning. My mother was dressed carefully. I noticed that, the way she'd put herself together like armor. My father looked like a man who hadn't slept. He hugged me when he came in, and I let him, because whatever Ray had or hadn't done, I believed he hadn't fully understood what Janet and Denise had set in motion. He was complicit by ignorance, and that was its own problem, but it was a different problem. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten 10,000 meals, where I'd done homework and had birthday dinners and talked about nothing important for hours. I had the folder in front of me. Ryan sat beside me. Neither of us had said much beyond hello. My mother opened with, "Morgan, I know you're upset, but..." I said, "Janet, I'm going to need you to stop there." I hadn't called her Janet before, not to her face. Her expression flickered. "I'm not here to have a feeling. I'm here to show you what I've documented and tell you what happens next." I opened the folder. I went through it piece by piece. The unauthorized occupancy, its legal classification, the duration, the evidence, the utility tampering and address changes, the HOA incident, Carol's testimony, the BAH inquiry. I paused on that one, let it sit, watched my mother's face go carefully blank. The forged signature, the financial trace to her credit card. I put it all on the table, literally, document by document. My mother said, you can't prove." I slid the handwriting analysis report across the table. She stopped talking. My father made a sound. Not words, just a sound. And I looked at him and I saw the moment he understood. Not the logistics, but the scope of what had been done in his own home without his knowledge. The look on his face was the most painful thing in that room. Because he wasn't the architect of it. He was just someone who'd loved his wife and trusted her, and now was sitting in his daughter's kitchen discovering what that trust had financed. I felt for him. I did. But I couldn't carry his feelings right now. I had to stay in my ER mode. I told them what was going to happen. The BAH fraud inquiry was already with the appropriate federal office. The JAG office had it. The Military Financial Crimes Unit had it. That was out of my hands. I hadn't filed it to punish them. I'd filed it because it was a federal matter, and I was legally obligated to report it once I knew. The civil matter, the unauthorized occupancy, the utility fraud, the financial damages, I had the option to pursue or to reach a settlement. I told them what a settlement would look like. Restitution for the financial damage to our household. Written acknowledgement of the events. A legally binding agreement about future contact with our property. My mother said, "You would do this to your own family?" I said, "You did this to your own family. I'm just the one making sure it has consequences." There was a long silence. Ryan put his hand on mine under the table. And then my father said, very quietly, "What do you need from us, Morgan?" That question. That small, honest, exhausted question from a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years in an hour. That was the crack in the wall. Not my mother's silence, not the folder, not even the federal documentation. My father asking what I needed, as if he remembered, for the first time in this whole mess, that I was a person who might need something. I told him. I told them both. Restitution in writing, a signed acknowledgement, no contact with our property without written invitation, and an answer. I needed an answer to the only question I cared about that wasn't in any document. Why? Not the logistics, the why. Why did it feel okay to do this to me? My mother didn't answer for a long time, and when she did, what she said surprised me. She didn't make excuses. She said, "Because we knew you could handle it. We always knew you'd be okay. It's easier to do things to people you know will survive it." And I understood that she thought that was almost kind, almost a compliment, that my resilience had functioned in her mind as permission. That's the thing about being the strong one. People stop asking if you're okay. They start using your strength as a license. They stop seeing it as something you chose and start seeing it as something they're entitled to. I told my mother that I forgave her. Not because what she'd done was forgivable in the transactional sense, the legal process would decide what it decided, but because carrying unforgiveness was weight I didn't want. I'd already been carrying enough. But I also told her that forgiveness didn't mean what she thought it meant. It didn't mean that things would go back to the way they were. It didn't mean that the boundaries I was setting would dissolve once the sting of this faded. Forgiveness, I told her, was something I was doing for myself. The consequences were something she was going to do for me, whether she liked it or not. They signed the settlement agreement 6 weeks later. The federal BAH matter was resolved separately. The inquiry had been denied before any funds were redirected, so there was no successful fraud, but the attempt had been documented, and there were administrative consequences on that end that were between my parents, Denise, and the federal government. Our household received restitution for the financial damages. The utilities were fully cleaned up and restored to our names and our addresses. The agreement was in place. And then I changed the locks. Not because I thought they were coming back, but because I needed to. Because the act of changing a lock is the physical embodiment of a boundary, and I needed to hold something in my hands that represented the new reality. I needed to feel the new key in my palm and know that I decided who had it. I gave one to Carol. I owe that woman a pie, maybe several pies. Ryan and I spent the first few weeks home doing what you do after something like this. We cleaned. Not just the cleaning you do when someone's been in your space, though we did that too. We cleaned in the deeper sense. We rearranged the living room because I didn't want to sit in exactly the configuration she'd left it in. I put my clothes back on my side of the closet. I bought a new cast iron pan. I cooked a meal in my kitchen and ate it at my table, and it tasted like ours again. Ryan replanted the garden. A few things had been neglected while we were both gone, and he came home and put his hands in the dirt and fixed them. I watched him from the kitchen window. This man who'd been halfway around the world, who'd come home to find his house occupied by people who'd betrayed us, who had sat at that table with a steadiness I will never stop being grateful for. He was replanting our garden like it was the most normal thing in the world, like putting things back in the ground was just what you did. I went out and knelt beside him in the dirt. He said, "These tomatoes are going to come back." I said, "Yeah, they are." I didn't talk to Denise for a long time. I still don't, not really. She sent a text about 3 months after everything settled. Not an apology exactly, more of a, "I've been thinking about what happened" kind of message that left all the weight on me to respond and carry forward. I stared at it for a few days, and then I deleted it. Maybe someday, but not yet. Not until there's something real to build it on. My mother and I have a different relationship now. Smaller, more careful. The Sunday phone calls still happen, but they're shorter, and they stay in the shallower end of the water. She knows where the deep end is now. She knows I'll say so if she gets near it. That's a strange kind of progress, not the warm, easy kind you hope for with your parents, but the honest kind. The kind that's real because it has to be, not because it's comfortable. My father and I rebuilt something. Slowly. Over coffee on weekday mornings when he'd drive up and we'd sit on the porch and not talk about any of it, which somehow said everything. He'd say, "How's the garden?" I'd say, "Coming back." And that would be enough. What this whole thing taught me, underneath all the legal documents and the folder and the ER mode that saved me. Home isn't the house you buy. It's not the mortgage or the square footage or the sage green guest room. Home is the door you get to lock. It's the people you choose to give the key to. And it took someone taking mine to make me understand how sacred that choosing was. I'm Morgan Hendress. I'm an ER nurse. I've spent my career showing up for people in their worst moments. Strangers, mostly, who needed someone to stay calm and stay present and do the next right thing. It turns out I was pretty good at doing that for myself, too. It just took me a while to know I was allowed to. If you've been the strong one in your family, the reliable one, the one they call, the one who shows up, I want you to hear this. Your strength is yours. It is not a resource. It is not a convenience. It is not permission. And the people who love you, the ones who really love you, will never make you prove it by asking you to bleed quietly. Lock your door, keep your key, and choose who gets to knock.